Austin that honors a unique woman and her work. Please join us.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion and life, produced by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC-TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm your host, Richard Thompson of Central Presbyterian Church. Elisabet Ney was an unconventional woman during a very conventional time. Ney, born in Germany during the 1830s, was the first woman to study sculpture at Munich Art Academy and then went on to continue her education at the Berlin Art Academy. In Europe, Ney met and sculpted portraits of many of the famous political and intellectual leaders of the day. But political upheavals in Germany at the beginning of the 1880s led to Ney's coming to America with a husband and with her expecting a child. It is in the United States that her work reached a new height. Sculptures included that of Sam Houston, shown at World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago just before the turn of the century. She also made marble works that were commissioned for the Texas and U.S. capitals. Ney became an Austin artist by making it a home for her studio. But by 1907, Ney, who was 74 years old, died. Luckily, through her friends, her dreams and her work have lived on, as the Elisabet Ney Museum was established. To that museum, Ney is attached to as a conservatory, which offers classes in bronze, clay, plaster, and stone. Today on this program, we're joined by two people who have made the Ney Museum an important part of their lives. Margie Hale is a volunteer at the Ney Museum, and we are also joined by Jim Fisher, who is the supervisor of curators at the museums through the Austin Park and Recreations Department. We thank you both for being with us today. And I have to admit to you, I'm really excited about the prospect of our learning more about Elisabet Ney and the museum and her work. And I have to tell you that my interest arises from the fact that I have a son and my daughter-in-law who live in Münster, where Ney came from. And I understand, Margie, that you spent a fair amount of time in Münster, and give us a little bit of a sense of where she was coming from there.
Well, she was coming from a small Catholic town in the northwest corner of Germany. It's in the Westphalia district. We've been there. We were asked to come to be interviewed at the National Archives there. There's a group of women who are trying to find some of the information about Ney that's been lost from the bombing of Europe. They're trying to collect it together. And as a result of that, we even had one of them come to appear on our doorstep at the Ney and spend a weekend with us, and that was a shock. But we took her to a Lady Longhorn game.
Well, that's a quick introduction into our culture, isn't it?
It's true.
Now, I understand that she grew up in a what you might call a rather conventional setting there. She was in the Catholic Church and went to parochial schools. And
that's true.
Give us a little sense of her religious background.
Her father and mother were devout Catholics. She had an older brother named Fritz, who was a plodding school teacher. And then this little girl came along, and she wasn't going to be a housefrau, wasn't interested in that aspect of being a woman at all. She learned everything her father could teach her.
Her father was...
he was a wood carver and a stone cutter.
Okay.
He did cemetery markers and religious works. She did not want to do that, and so far as we know, she only made one for a cemetery, and that's an angel in Fredericksburg.
And just before the show, you were telling me about her fasting at one point?
At 17, she decided she'd learned all that she could learn from her father, and so she announced at breakfast one morning, to their great dismay, that she was going to Berlin to study under Christian Rauch, who was the most famous sculptor of the day. And they said no. She said yes, and that rocked along for a while. And finally, to get away, she started fasting. And they thought, well, a teenager, she'll forget this in a little while, but she didn't. So Bishop Mueller of the Dom in Münster, you probably have seen it,
right.
He came to talk to this little fractious girl. And he couldn't get anywhere either, but he got the two sides to compromise. She agreed to wait a year until she was 18 and agreed to go to Munich, which was a good Catholic city, instead of a Protestant-flavored Berlin. They thought she'd be safer, but actually Munich wasn't safe from her either.
I see. Okay, well, you know, I think, Jim, one of the things that I picked up from both what Margie said and the biography that is available at the museum there about her is that she was ahead of her time as far as being a feminist. And how did you see that continuing from that point?
A lot of her ideas were ahead of her time. Although her lifestyle was very, I'd say, very disciplined. A lot of her ideas were so revolutionary, I think they were too far advanced for people to even argue them. The people were simply mystified by them.
Ideas like the equality of women?
She objected to the fact that women could not become priests in the Catholic Church. I think although she was married, she felt the institution of marriage was mainly a tool for subjugating women, and
she always kept her own name.
She disliked being called by her married name. She preferred to be addressed as Miss Ney. That has given rise to some of the lurid legends about her, like the fact that they weren't married, but we do have their marriage license at the museum.
Right. Well, as far as her work was concerned, I've noticed that some critics have said that it was pretty much reflective of the style of that time, that she wasn't really out front a lot in terms of her sculpting.
It pretty much reflects the style in art of the period that she grew into adulthood. The ideas in art that were current in this country as well as in Europe in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. What's called, I think, classical romanticism. She liked to focus on the character and personality of the people she was doing portraits of at that time and eliminate unnecessary decoration. A good analogy to her portraits are the portraits of Rembrandt with their psychological penetration of the people he painted, and also the elimination of unnecessary decoration in the pictures.
I see.
Later on in the 1890s, grace, a lot of decoration became popular, and her art, I think, perhaps began to seem a little bit anachronistic by that time. Like, even though she was an eminent, well-known artist, it was not, her art was probably no longer influential by the end of her life.
One of the things that struck me was that while she was in Europe, among the things that you can see at the museum, at least the plaster casts of and pictures in the books that are there, is Bismarck. I mean, the one who brought the various states to make Germany a nation. She had Schopenhauer, a great German philosopher of the time. She had crazy King Ludwig.
He was not crazy. You don't do that in Munich and tell anybody that.
No.
They'll hit you on the head.
Okay.
He was not crazy. He was eccentric.
Okay.
He was a major patron of Ney. He
Right.
commissioned a lot of work.
But she had important patronage, and that probably to some extent dictated the fact that she was still fairly conventional in her style. And yet you're saying that beyond that was the psychological study of, let's just take one example of, I think later on, toward the end of her life, she was the portrait of, or the figure of Lady Macbeth. Which,
well, that was in 1905, but she had been thinking of what she was going to, how she was going to portray Lady Macbeth for 30 years before she did it. And it took her 5 years to finish the work. And she wrote and said that she was so emotional when she looked at it that she had to keep it covered most of the time.
Explain why it took her so long and why she felt so emotional about that.
I don't think that's another one of the questions nobody knows. I think she was portraying herself and the difficulties that she had. And so she was emotionally involved with this figure in
How
literature.
she might have identified with Lady Macbeth, we're really not sure. There are some parallels between them, but what the appeal of Shakespeare's play or character was, we can't really be sure.
But we do know that in the 1870s, like there was this political battle between Ludwig and Bismarck, and some have speculated that that was part of the reason, at least, that she came to America.
That's only one theory.
Okay.
There are several. When we went to Munich, we found we couldn't find anybody who'd ever heard of her at the Pinakothek and Alte Pinakothek, Neue Pinakothek. Nobody, the curators never heard of her. and that was a problem. We'd gone there to find answers, not more questions.
Right.
And we finally found a man who'd been an editor of the Bavarian newspaper, who'd left the newspaper and was writing a history of, 12-volume history of Bavaria, Hans Neubauer.
Yes.
And he has a chapter on Ney.
Uh-huh.
And it was very enlightening. He was very helpful.
And did you get more insight as to what the difficulties were that led to her coming to...
His theory had nothing to do with the politics.
Okay.
And since then, we've seen an article in a German newspaper published last October that confirmed what Hans had said.
Which was?
That she may have been pregnant with King Ludwig's child.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh.
And felt the urgency to leave the country. She applied for a visa to leave Germany to go to Morocco and Spain and Morocco. But she didn't. They went north to Bremen and got on a boat and came to this country.
I see. And when they came to this country, after, I guess, spending some time in Georgia before...
2 years.
Coming to Texas, and then they settled not in Austin, but east of here.
Hempstead, near Hempstead.
And had sort of their estate there, and then she started her studio here. That's how the progression went.
She gave up sculpting for 20 years for some unknown reason. And then when she came back, she was in the old art school, and no one in Europe knew about her. They didn't even know where she was.
Well, to me, that's one of the most impressive things about her life, is that after 2 decades of, you know, being a homemaker and running to a large extent, being the business manager of their estate.
She was never a homemaker.
Oh, okay.
Never. She brought her a housekeeper from Austria.
Aha, okay, stand correct.
Homemaker, she would have, she's turning over her grave now.
Okay, well, we'll end that as quickly as we can, and take note of the fact that she was out of commission as far as her art was concerned for that period of time.
That probably had a lot to do with her having 2 children, because when her surviving son was grown, it seems to have had a lot to do, or at least to have facilitated her going back to her career. It's interesting because I think she had originally resolved that were she to get married and have children, she was not going to sacrifice her career, but then she went ahead and did it voluntarily.
Well, she married under protest. She didn't want to be married, but her doctor husband insisted his patients didn't understand their relationship. They must be married. So she agreed on the island of Madeira, where they were married, if he promised never to divulge the fact that they were married. And he kept the promise all of his life. Except the one time that he broke the promise was to apply for citizenship in this country. And he had to admit that they were married.
Well, she was personality in every aspect of her life. I mean,
Capital P personality.
But picking up on what you were saying, Jim, in terms of her, once she came here, and she did re-enter the field, what led her finally to come back into the practice of her sculpting?
Her surviving son was, I think, had grown. One of their very good friends, Governor Orrin Roberts, had commissioned a portrait of himself to try to get her interested back in sculpture, and he donated that to the University of Texas on the day he signed the bill founding it. And some of her friends, I think, arranged for the very important commissions to do the famous figures of Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston for the Columbian Exposition.
Well, it's with those Texas figures in mind, we'll pause for a moment and come back to, but we're going to take a break, and we'll be back soon to continue our discussion about Elisabet Ney and the museum.
Serving Austin means serving you. Each day, Austin Metropolitan Ministries is religion in action, providing affordable housing, caring for the elderly, marching against hunger, and much more. AMM promotes understanding, cooperation, and social involvement. So when we ask for your help, we're really asking to help you, Austin. To find out how you can help Austin Metropolitan Ministries help Austin through its member organizations, just call 472-7627.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us today on Austin Faith Dialogue, and we're looking at the work and considering the life of Elisabet Ney and the museum named after her. This tour of the Ney Museum is being done by Margie Hale, a docent volunteer at the museum, and Jim Fisher, a former director at the Ney Museum and now with Austin Park Districts as a supervisor. Jim, we were talking before the break about the fact that she had come to Texas and had received commissions for Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. Mentioned at the opening that one of these was at the Columbian World's Fair in the 1890s, and then people going into the Capitol today see her work.
Yes.
The state capitol, that is.
The two statues were actually cut twice in marble, so there are identical versions, one on either side of the main entrance to the Texas Capitol here in Austin, and the other pair in the what they call Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Also in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institution is her, I think, acknowledged masterpiece, the sculpture called Lady Macbeth.
I see, right. And Margie, isn't it true, as you are the docent there at the museum, that you're showing people around, you have occasion to say that Elisabet Ney and her husband were really intrigued with Texas and that there was a colony of artists here and poets?
No,
and
that
so
was not what they came for.
It was not?
In fact, they led an isolated life on their plantation Leendo outside of Hempstead. They didn't join an art colony. He was a doctor and he was doing his philosophical papers and research and pro and con of evolution.
Okay.
So he lived in his world, his scientific world. She lived in hers.
But there were, if not a colony, at least a group of people with cultural interests of German background here.
Well, the German background of the people that were buying and building in Scheib's development out at Hyde Park must have intrigued her. Wealthy Germans and the German heritage. And
they lived in this new suburb.
They didn't. He stayed in Leendo most of the time.
The German people here had homes out there. Is that why she happened to settle in Hyde Park?
I think that's the way that she chose Hyde Park.
Yeah, Hyde Park was predominantly German, and Scheib himself was German and was a close friend of Ney.
And may have influenced her locating there, you think?
Probably.
Probably, and there were people there, of course, she could speak German with, and she became very good friends with a lot of the people in the neighborhood. There are still families out in Hyde Park to this day who have traditions in the family, the grandparents being good friends of Elisabet Ney.
I see, yeah. Well, now, let's go ahead and get on the screen what the, you know, the address and phone number and all of that is. I know it's out by 45th Street. Give us more specifics on that.
It's at, actually at East 44th and Avenue A in Hyde Park. It's been there since she died in 1907, and was probably the first art museum in the state of Texas to permanently open in a permanent location. We're open Wednesday through Saturday every week from 10 to 5 and Sunday from 12 to 5.
Yeah. And I think this, as people come to this, they should know that this was her studio. This is where she worked. As you lead people around, you indicate where that she was living and where she was working?
It was built in two sections in 1892, the first section where she had a working studio. She had a loft that she allowed herself to live in. And she had a trap door so that she wouldn't have to clean house. She'd just sweep it out on the ground.
Her sweep holes, we called it.
See, she was not a housefrau.
Okay.
The building is, I'm sorry to interrupt
Go
you.
ahead.
The building's a great place to take children because I don't know if it was modeled along the lines of a medieval castle, but it looks like one. It has spiral staircases and trap doors and stone walls and
Yeah, kids would love that, wouldn't they?
It, beyond the odd ambience of it, it still represents the world of a 19th century artist with all of the tools and furnishings and accoutrements and that sort of thing.
Well, now, is it also the case that as people go through the museum there, you just give us a little bit of a sense of how you make the rounds with them as a docent?
Well, there are two main rooms for the sculptors that she has in the studio. One that we call the European room and one the Texas room. And everything that's in the European room are pieces that she did in Europe. And the reason they were here and saved from the bombing is because she cleaned out a studio that she had in the Schwabing area of Munich and brought them here in the 90s. And so they're there and preserved. And then when she took up sculpting again, she did many, many governors. They're all in the Texas room. Lady Macbeth, Albert Sidney Johnston, the famous general, and he's in the State Cemetery, and everybody should be encouraged to go see that. It's one of her masterpieces, too.
And it's interesting, there's a parallel there, because she did the great and famous people of Europe, and then she came into the same thing in Texas.
That's what she said when she was a little girl. She wanted to do famous people, and she did famous people.
What's kind of nice, she often spoke of her Texan works as her personal gallery of heroes. She really believed, like everyone else in those days, it's hard to imagine that people really saw themselves as creating a civilization and devoting themselves to something more important than themselves. And I think it's nice that now so many of her Texan portraits are actually gathered together out there in a literal gallery of heroes.
Right. Tell us about the school or the institute that's connected to it, where people today can continue that creative process.
There have always been classes in sculpture out at the museum, I think mainly aimed at trying to preserve some of her ideas and techniques that are no longer as common or as commonly taught now as they once were. Carving in stone, modeling in wax, in clay, casting in bronze, the techniques for making plaster casts, which she always did. She modeled in clay and then made cast the work in plaster, which is confusing because that process resulted in the destruction of the clay sculpture. So you don't have any clay sculptures around.
But what you do have is the preservation of techniques that are not so common anymore. And the reason for preserving those is what?
Well, sculpture remains important to us, figurative or literal sculpture. The techniques are important and basic, even though they may not necessarily be commonly emphasized in universities anymore. And there is a lot of enthusiasm.
You have a number of folks that show up for that?
A lot of people that are interested in learning these techniques, and a lot of people that like to look at that kind of sculpture.
Sure. And if people want information about how to sign up for that program, they can call the number that we showed earlier.
Yes, they're welcome to call the office in our conservatory, which is, I think, 371-7606, and is listed separately in the telephone book.
Okay. As we come into the closing minutes of the show, I'd like to reflect on one particular work that you show folks out there, Margie, this Sursum Corda. I was struck by the name because in the liturgy of the church that is referring to responses by the people, lift up your hearts. And the question is, this is not particularly dealing with liturgy, but give us some interpretation of why she may have called this work that.
Well, she felt the word Sursum was important. It was important for her and for her husband, Dr. Montgomery. In fact, she named her studios Sursum. The one that she first had in Madeira, and the one here has Sursum carved on the outside of the building.
So that means lift up?
Lift up, go forward, don't look back,
That's
don't
the
regret.
spirit of her.
Onward and upward.
And the figures of the two genies are walking up a hill, helping each other forward with the key of knowledge and the light to light the way.
So one is carrying a key and one is carrying
a torch.
And that represented her her conviction about what
what
art was
mankind is all
about.
about. Her art was a way of pointing to it to people and demonstrating that she and her husband felt their role in life was.
Well, that's what I think is fitting for us to focus on, because despite the fact that in terms of organized religion, that she had left that early in life, nevertheless she carried a spirit with her.
They did.
About what life's purpose is, and a power that was working through her, I would guess, because she obviously had a creative force that was manifest both in Europe and here. She kept it a lifelong process, and despite 20 years of not practicing her art, she came back to it. And to me, this is the impressive thing about her, is that she was in ongoing process of development and growth.
Her later works are, if anything, like a lot of artists, are probably the strongest of her life. When
Well,
in her
certainly
60s
Albert
and
Sidney
70s.
Johnston and Lady Macbeth are examples of that.
Yeah.
And so you think better from what standpoint?
They have more emotional power, more technical proficiency. Lady Macbeth is technically was a sensation at the time, but it's a marvelous sculpture. You can explore it endlessly. It's a real
If
tour
you
de
can
force.
get anybody to find it for you, because we were told where it was and went there, and they said, no, it's not here. It's on one of the separate buildings of the Smithsonian on Avenue F.
I see. And what we have here is a plaster cast of that?
We think of the plasters as the pattern, or the originals, because they were the patterns for the marble sculpture.
Yeah. And I was interested in the story you shared with me about her head of Christ, which she sculpted in order for, hopefully, to get a commission. And it wound up in San Antonio in a jewelry shop.
They didn't even show it at the World's Fair in St. Louis because it was too big. They didn't have room for it. So her
she made it for that.
She was dreaming of making some money. She was always broke.
Yeah.
And so she gambled wrong.
And then after somehow it found its way into the museum at Fort Worth in the basement, you said, and as late as recently as the 1980s that they found it, and all of a sudden it became available to us here. And
they placed it here on permanent loan. I think the Fort Worth Art Museum just didn't have the space either to show it or to store it.
well, their loss is certainly our gain.
Certainly
That
is.
is true.
And I tell you, it's really been our gain to have you folks here today. You've given us
Thank you.
both information and the sense of the spirit of one that we can celebrate being a local contributor to our culture and our life. I'm sorry to say, however, that we're out of time. I want to thank our guests, Margie Hale and Jim Fisher, for joining us and sharing their experiences. I'd like to invite you folks to be back with us next week on our next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson, and peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries